to kind of continue on from what we were talking about yesterday, we talked about the faceless men from Game of Thrones, of this weird idea of being no one, which built on previous ideas we talked about in this kind of section of the podcast episodes, which is all about, like, you know, who are we? What's the conscious part of us? What does it represent? What's a healthier way of understanding how we're kind of existing here? And that's obviously a deep, very deep topic. But we're only kind of just scratching the surface in a couple episodes, so don't worry, we're not getting too heavy. And yeah, for those familiar with Game of Thrones, or hopefully the last episode, you'll be up to speed on what the idea of the faceless men are and the characters from the show. And there are two sayings that are very common and popular amongst these characters in the show. So the first is Valar Morghulis, which they say all the time. And Valar Morghulis means all men must die. And they say it all the time to one another as they walk around. It's actually a greeting, and the language in the shows and the books is High Valyrian, and it's kind of like a common greeting, kind of like how we say hi, how are you? So it's pretty funny that is their kind of greeting. And yeah, very, very amusing. All men must die. In some sense, you can see how it's a very it is a good message to actually portray all the time, because when you look around in your day-to-day life, you'll see the way a lot of people act doesn't actually make sense when you consider the fact that we're all going to die one day. It's actually very interesting to kind of look at people's behavior when you keep that in mind. You know, most people do spend a lot of time in their lives and worrying about things that just don't seem to matter when you actually contemplate the fact that our time is so limited, and we don't know how limited it is. So it's always really interesting to kind of reflect on. So having a constant reminder that all men must die, even though it seems really dark and pessimistic, is probably actually quite a useful thing. And I don't know, maybe that's how we should actually all greet each other all the time. Valar Morghulis, like in the show. All men must die. And it also, I guess, brings perspective back to our existence, right? And that's our theme at the moment for the pod. It brings that perspective back for us. One of my favorite questions, obviously, I'm not sure if I've mentioned on the podcast before, but it's possibly my favorite ever reflective question, and I do hoard the questions for those who know me personally or have been on retreats and stuff like that I've run. If you were going to die in 5 years, say you had a mysterious terminal illness, and it was going to kill you in 5 to 10 years, not 4, 3, 2, or 1, but 5, how would you live differently? It's one of my favorite questions to ask, because it's just long enough that it's not tomorrow. When you say tomorrow, it's normally a hedonistic response, like I'm just going to party and go to the beach and call everyone, tell them I love them, so it's too easy. But I love the 5-year one because there's more time. Your life has to be sustainable, and you've got time to do a meaningful project. And I really love living with that rule of thumb that I've only got kind of another 5 years to go from this point in time, because it keeps really good perspective on things. So reminding ourselves that all men must die is pretty useful to borrow more wisdom from these faceless men and women, of course, but that's just what they're called in the show. The other saying, though, that is not said quite as often, but is normally a reply when characters in the show say Valar Morghulis, is Valar Dahiris, which means all men must serve. And that I reflected when I think I wrote the blog post on Become a Faceless Man on the site. I think I reflected on that significance of those two things together and in that order for the first time. And I actually thought it was quite profound. I don't know if this was intended by the writers. It's this idea that first all men must die. In other words, we must kill this idea we have of ourselves. But then, in response, all men must serve. Last episode I talked about when you think of yourself as no one, as just another person in the crowd, this paradox that we're all super special, but we're all not really special because we're just like everyone else, and dropping the need for our own self-importance. probably gives you permission to see a lot more clearly and drop a lot of the biases we have in our thinking that really actually obstruct us. And they're kind of like a wall we've built to protect our ego, our self-esteem, and we drop them. And I just find it so interesting, this idea that once you've killed that idea of your grandeur, then the reminder, I guess, with this community is all men must serve. So it really builds well on the ideas I talked in the last episode about enabling yourself to see what your role is, what your purpose is. And I talked about my rule of thumb, the I only do what only I can do rule, which you always think about when you think about the 5-year death question, or what I call the 5-year question. You know, if you're not here in another 5 years, or after another 5 years, what are you going to spend the next 5 years on? And that really makes you drop all the bullshit and focus on what is your best service. And I think there's 2 amazing quotes. One's from Confucius. It's that we all have 2 lives, and the second begins once we realize we only have one. And there's another one from Mark Twain, which goes something along the lines of, there are 2 important days in your life, and the day you're born, and then the day you realize why. And I just love the combination of those 2 quotes together, especially in the context of this episode. There was, so sorry for anyone who didn't enjoy learning about religion and Catholic and Bible stuff in school, but there's a story, obviously in the New Testament of the Bible, about a bloke called St. Paul, and he used to be called Saul, and he used to actually persecute I guess Jesus' early kind of followers, and what was then not called this, but the early Christianity kind of movement. And he used to actually be the one chasing them and persecuting them. He had a fancy education and was well-to-do in society. And then there's this whole story on the road to Damascus where he falls, and then he has a vision of Jesus, and he goes blind for 3 days, and then he kind of comes back. And it's interesting, in Game of Thrones, Arya Stark, who's our whole lens for observing the whole faceless man dynamic, actually goes blind as well, which I never thought about. But then the story with Paul is that he then started as Saul, has this transformation, then does a complete 180 and becomes this guy Paul, who actually then, becomes almost facilitates the whole Catholic Church becoming a thing. So regardless of your feelings about the Catholic Church, it's a really interesting story. And it follows that whole, killing the idea of the grand version of ourselves, in this case, literally redefining it from Saul into Paul, and then seeing the role that he could play to kind of serve others. So how is that relevant to you today, that idea? My question for the day for you to reflect on is, who do you serve? So you're doing something now. You might be a physiotherapist. You might be an entrepreneur. You might be a podcaster. You might be a writer. You might be a mother. You might be a parent, a friend, or some combination of those things. But my question to you right now is, who do you serve? And if you're studying at the moment and you're preparing for something, or you're just at school, what's it all for? Where is it going? And who are you going to serve based on what you're learning? And it's really interesting. Obviously I can't ask you that question without talking about myself, so I'm forced to think of it myself. And I never intended to actually get into any form of business career or podcasting and writing career. Certainly a couple of years ago, I was studying, for those who know my story, I was studying psychology. I was probably a little bit interested in film, but I never really thought of getting to this. I guess I normally followed the things that were just kind of put in front of me. And I think, with real estate and non-profit work, and I guess the non-profit work was always very clear a mission to me, because it was always clear who we were serving. And when you think of yourself as no one, instead of focusing on narratives of your own self-importance, you're focusing on narratives of who you can serve, I think is the message. And that's the liberating part of realizing how small a part we actually play in this whole dynamic of us, and how we're a collective, and all the ideas I talked about in the previous episodes. And we're not this individual autonomous voice completely, but we're kind of like this coach. So I've talked about that. So it's really interesting to think about. So your question today is, who do you serve? So this has been the With Joe Wehbe podcast. Remember, you can always go to the blog for more at www.withjoewehbe.com. That's got any of the books I'm working on, or the blog posts I write, and details about the podcast and everything else. And you can sign up there for email if you want any of this delivered to you via email. But apart from that, just remember, as always, the best way to open 1,000 doors for you is to concentrate on opening doors for others. In other words, who are you going to go serve? And yeah, this is a daily podcast, so I guess I'll see you again tomorrow.